Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this conference on the digitization of Africa, International Power Plays. Very pleased to welcome you all. My name is Alice Panier. I'm the head of the Geopolitics of Technology program. A quick word in French. Un petit mot en français pour vous signaler que pour des raisons techniques, l'interprétation n'est pas disponible au final pour cette conférence. Donc vraiment navré pour celles et ceux qui souhaitaient suivre la conférence en français. Nous espérons que vous pourrez tout de même profiter des échanges en anglais. So, this is the annual conference of the Geopolitics of Technology program, and it's the third annual conference of the program, and each year we try to organize it in cooperation with other teams at IFRI in order to maximize the interest and the expertise that we can share with you all through these events. And so I'm very pleased this year to organize the conference jointly with IFRI's Center on Sub-Saharan Africa, and in particular with the Governing the Urban Transition in Africa program, which is headed by Sina Schlimmer, who will chair the second panel. First words of thank you to all of those who helped organize the conference. So Sina Schlimmer, Lise Le Signe, Mathilde Vellier, Anaïs Leleu, Simon Giraud, Nadia Fraioli, Barbara Delançois, Mena Larbès, and Nicolas Lang. It's obviously always a collective effort to make these events happen. And obviously a big thank you as well to our speakers who have traveled, some of them from quite far away in order to be here with us today. So today we're going to be talking about Africa's digitalization. So I want to say a few words of the context of the why of this conference before leading into the first panel. Obviously, in Africa, like anywhere else in the world, the digital infrastructure and services are decisive for any country or city's ability to do business, to interact, to consume. It's become so defining in many levels in Africa. We talk especially a lot about fintech, agri-tech, small and medium-sized enterprises, access to digital services, e-government services, etc. And in the second panel, we're going to talk in particular about smart cities, which can be seen as hubs of digital infrastructure. In Africa, we have a situation where internet access is limited. There is a 64% internet coverage in urban areas, but only 23% in rural areas. And also, as we know, the fixed broadband access is quite limited, almost negligible in many parts, and internet access occurs chiefly through mobile phones. So there is potentially a lot to do in terms of improving access to digital infrastructure and services. This access is also limited by the cost of those services and the lack of skills among the population and private sector actors. There is a lot of international interest in, and also local, obviously, interest in Africa's digital potential. And this international interest is driven by also the opportunities that infrastructure and service development can offer. So with this interest comes international competition, including geopolitical and economic competition, which are playing out at all the layers, if you like, of digital infrastructure and services or of the technology stack. Whether we're talking about international undersea cables and satellites, telecommunication companies and internet services providers, mobile handsets, cloud networks, operating systems, apps, and content platforms, etc. So we've seen those past few years the development of initiatives from international players, such as China's Digital Silk Road, the EU's Global Gateway, and several programs by the US as well, together with initiatives from international players like the World Bank and the United Nations, as well as obviously private sector initiatives as well. So all of those initiatives, as well as this need for developing technological infrastructure and services, pose a number of challenges and risks, which I hope we will discuss a bit today as far as Africa's digitization is concerned. Obviously, questions about digital sovereignty when we see international players coming into the region. What does it mean for Africa's digital sovereignty? What does it mean also in terms of laws and regulations, such as data protection, for example, on the continent, as well as cybersecurity concerns. And so we'll also be tackling how local actors, whether private sector or governments, as well as civil society, pursue their interests through those international partnerships to also meet their own needs. So from there, the first panel will be looking at digital infrastructure partnerships through the lens of both geopolitical competition and local strategies. I will not provide you with the detailed biographies of the speakers, because you will find them, I think, in the chat if you're on Zoom, or on the through the QR code that's available at the entrance of this conference room. But we will kick off with David Ringrose, who is joining us remotely from Brussels, sadly due to strikes on the Belgian public transport. He's the head of division at the European External Action Service, in charge of digital partnerships. So David Ringrose will tackle this question of the EU's global gateway, and filling us in on what this initiative is about. The global gateway was announced, I think, in December 2021, announcing 300 billion worth of infrastructure development projects for the green and digital transition, and has led to quite a few announcements of projects, especially in the digital sector in Africa, with countries such as Kenya, Nigeria, Namibia, and Senegal. So David, can you please explain to us what are the ambitions of Global Gateway, how it is unfolding, how it works, and in particular how it navigates the fact that when we talk about the EU, we always talk about the Commission on the one hand, the EU member states on the other hand, the private sector, and also in relations with other international actors, and perhaps also filling us in on what are the conditions under which projects are decided by the EU and negotiated with partners in Africa. So I'll give you the floor for, I think, about something like 10 to 12 to 15 minutes. And once all the panelists have given their remarks, we will obviously have a Q&A session for both people in the room and online. So David, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you today. I thought in order to sort of structure my my presentation, I would show a few slides. So at this point, I'm going to share my screen, and I hope it works properly this time.
It does.
I hope you can all see that.
Yes.
Wonderful. The root of what we're doing, not everything just started a year or so ago. I think the most significant discussion we had was in the previous college, when we set up what we called an EU African Union Digital Economy Task Force with 20 experts, ministers, academics, people from the private sector, I think including Orange. 5 years ago, and agreed in Vienna a report which was basically a blueprint for what we thought needed to be done for the digital transition in Africa. This is the announcement of the meeting with President Juncker and Commissioner Gabriel and everybody else. And I think a large part of the content and the work from that was taken up in the African Union's own digital transformation strategy that it announced a year or so later. Now, the Global Gateway, as you said, Alice, it was agreed almost exactly two years ago. And since then, as far as Africa is concerned, we had the first significant discussion took place at the EU-African Union Summit about 100 days later in February 2022, where the Commission announced that of the projected 300 target of investment that would be mobilizing under Global Gateway, half of it would be dedicated to Africa. And we'll be able to see where we are in the ministerial that's taking place in a couple of weeks with the African Union on that promise. And as you said, Global Gateway is designed to meet the challenge of investment in infrastructure in a number of sectors. Digital is one of those sectors, but of course the thing about digital is that it's in all of the others as well. You can't do climate change without looking at smart metering. You can't do transport without looking at the data produced by high-speed trains. You can't, as we learned during COVID, you can't do health or education without e-health and home learning and things like this. So the objective of Global Gateway across all of these sectors is to set up transformative packages of investments in infrastructure and the enabling environment. So sort of the regulatory frameworks, the skills required and all of that. And this is not just about EU public finance, but a large part of what we're trying to do is to develop financial instruments that will enable the private sector to invest by de-risking, because of course a lot of the countries in which we're trying to invest, the financial premium for investing is a little bit higher than it might be for investing in some of our member states, for example. So that's a lot of work around what we call the EFSD Plus, which is the financial instrument that we are using primarily. The political discussion around this as well takes place within the Foreign Affairs Council, and now every year the Foreign Affairs Council, which is the meeting of ministers of foreign affairs of the member states, chaired by my boss, the High Representative and Vice President Borrell, meets every summer to discuss where are we on digital in foreign policy. So not digital in the line ministries with the communication ministers and so on, but with the foreign ministers. And in the meeting in June earlier this year, in the conclusions which are available online, there's a paragraph on Africa where the ministers of foreign affairs of the EU call on the member states, High Representative and the Commission to do more on Africa to ensure that it's all well coordinated, because of course one of the failings often of policies is that we get things in the wrong order. And I think in digital, for example, it's very clear that simply increasing capacity in digital and investment in infrastructure without corresponding increases in cybersecurity capacity, for example, can cause more problems than it's solving. So the foreign ministers called us to do work in that area, together, of course, with the African Union, who are our principal partners, but also, interestingly, with Smart Africa, which I think is one of the most effective actors in the digital area in Africa. And the areas that we're looking at are more or less the ones that you announced at the beginning. So connectivity, security, open internet, the twin transitions, and research. So what are we actually doing? Firstly, under secure connectivity, there's a number of projects that you may have seen announced. For example, the Medusa cable, which is a partnership between EIB and some private investors, and with EU money as well. The objective is to connect a lot of countries in the south of the EU member states together with partners in Northern Africa, specifically research institutes and so on. This is funded partly from the research budget. And this should enable, this is a 7,000 kilometer cable that should enable a lot more collaboration between the EU and our partners in the Southern Mediterranean. Another project is the Euro-Africa cable. This is, if you like, an outgrowth of one of the most significant projects we did recently, which was the Bella cable linking Europe and Latin America, so specifically Portugal and Brazil. And in order to develop what we call sort of triangular cooperation, that cable is now linked to Africa as well, coming ashore in Mauritania. And we're looking at another cable that can link that. So that will bring high-speed connectivity directly between Europe and between Africa and Latin America. We're looking at investments in green data centers, particularly green, obviously, because we're perfectly aware that while digital can be part of the solution to the twin transition, it's also part of the problem with the massive electricity requirements of everything from 5G base stations to data centers. So we're looking at setting up a digital investment facility with partners to invest in green data centers in Africa. We have an increasing program of cyber capacity building, and I think there's a conference in Ghana in a couple of weeks on cyber capacity building in Africa, where we're working with our colleagues on cyber and in the member states to enhance responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And one of the main elements of our work on secure connectivity is the secure part, because for those of you who know the EU's 5G toolbox, this is basically the way in which we're dealing with investments in 5G in the European Union. This includes an obligation on the EU to ensure that all investments in connectivity infrastructure outside the EU, using EU money in any way, also apply to the 5G toolbox, which means mitigating efforts, use of trusted vendors, and so on. And that's obviously an important part of everything we're doing in connectivity. There's a lot of initiatives which are either Pan-African or working with different regions or multilateral, and just a few of those. One is a big project we have on Pan-African data governance, because while some partners, for example, might be going around Africa and saying it's in your interest to ensure that all of your data is located on the territory of your state, that is not what we think. Of course, in the European Union a few years ago, we passed legislation to ensure that we can have a single data space within the EU against data localization, so that member states data in one member state can be held on a data center in another one, and so on, and that there's only minimum exceptions to that. And we're working with our partners in Africa as part of the African Free Trade Area to see how we can build a data layer to that, so that data can flow freely amongst members of the African Union, thereby supporting the creation of a big Pan-African data economy. And I think that's a big, when people ask us what is the European approach different to that of other partners, I think we view data the same as we view any other critical raw material. And when we're talking with our partners in Africa about lithium or cobalt and so on, we're not trying to just extract the raw materials and take them back home for processing and adding all the value back home. What we're trying to do with data, the same as with any other critical raw material, is to add value for our partners in Africa, so developing an innovative data economy. We've done a lot of work on the open internet, because we found, for example, from a very practical point of view, we see in Geneva, in the ITU, that you have a lot of African countries represented by maybe one person, and they're representing their country at the ITU, at the WTO, and bilaterally to Switzerland. And when votes come up on the ITU about the open internet, sometimes they're not really well aware of what all the issues are for their country and so on, and they might vote in an area, they might vote for measures that we think are going to undermine the open internet. So we've worked with a lot of countries, including Senegal, and here you can see Macky Sall with the president just a week or so ago, to see if we can identify the impact of an open internet on individual countries in Africa, so that then they can have a much better idea of what proposals from China, for example, might mean for their economy, for the startups and so on. The Declaration for the Future of the Internet, we've worked with a number of countries in Africa to try to see if we can get support for this. This was a EU-US declaration of a couple of years ago that we're now taking forward in the IGF, for example, the Internet Governance Forum, and trying to see how we can develop a sort of a multi-stakeholder approach to implementing the declaration. And Cape Verde, Nigeria, Kenya and Senegal all signed the declaration. And then finally, the biggest multilateral issue around at the moment is the Global Digital Compact in the United Nations. And having listened into a lot of the deep dives in New York on these subjects, I think we were struck by the fact that the discussion basically is G7 plus China. And you hardly hear any African voices discussing on these digital issues in the Global Digital Compact. And we want to be sure that we can increase the involvement of our African partners in these discussions, because this should be an inclusive global debate. And that means, for example, that we're providing a lot of briefing materials for the ambassadors in Geneva and also in New York on what all of these issues are and so on, so to help them be involved in the debates. There's also, as you said, a lot of national projects. In Kenya, we have a program covering e-governance, education, and this we're also working with the United States in the framework of the Trade and Technology Council to try to partner up with third countries, because obviously we want to show that the EU-US Trade and Technology Council is not just for the EU and for the US, but it's also bringing benefits for other partners. So we work with, for example, with the Philippines, with Jamaica, but also with Kenya to try to see how we can work together effectively in Kenya. In Nigeria, the biggest digital economy package that we had was presented a year or so ago, and it's now rolling out over the next couple of years with funding on e-identity, for example, cybersecurity, digital projects for youth, and also some connectivity elements. And we're now working on the next packages, for example, with DRC. And then finally, just to sort of how we're doing this, and the key word here is Team Europe, because I think this is one of the biggest changes to how we're working with our partners in Africa, is that this is not just the EU and the EU delegation, but that we realized during COVID that we have to work together with the member states, and that we have many member states who have significant projects in Africa, through AFD, through KfW, through PMO, and so on. And so we need to work together more effectively, which means and also with the IFIs, with the European Investment Bank, with EBRD, and with the World Bank, and so on. So we're setting up what we call informal digital hubs, which is a way of coordinating better between the European Union delegations, the EU embassies, and what we call the D4D hub, which is a structure that involves the development agencies of the member states, because we realize that obviously, unlike transport, energy, water, and so on, the amount of expertise on these issues in our development cooperation partners is not as high, and we need to therefore all work together. So as a result of this, we're doing a lot of training, providing support for conferences, capacity building, and so on, and also looking at setting up a specific fund for connectivity that we can then use to support the work we're doing in Africa. So that's more or less where we are. The work continues. And on your final point, Alice, when you talked about how are all these projects being decided, at the moment, we are putting together the list of global gateway projects for next year. And we do this with the member states in a working group that meets tomorrow. And the process is basically we come up with a list of projects together with our delegations, with the EIB and so on. And then we discuss this in the council. Individual member states add projects as well. So at the moment, we're in the process of creating lots of lists and Excel tables and so on, and then discussing those with the member states to see which are the flagships that we think are particularly transformative, with all respect to the sort of criteria that we have for geographical criteria, for involvement of civil society and the private sector and so on. So this is an ongoing process, and we'll come up with another list of projects that would be endorsed by the member state at the board meeting in December. So I hope that was useful, and happy to listen and then answer any other questions.
Thank you, David. That was extremely clear and informative. I would have follow-up questions, but I'll wait until the Q&A time. I found it interesting what you said about creating a free flow of data, a context of free flow of data, and if you like, an open data space in Africa on the same model as the one that is developed in Europe, and to prevent data localization attempts, because I think that links very well to what Henry is going to talk about, which are Chinese and also American data center deployments in Africa, and the conditions and strategies around those deployments. So Henry Tugendhat is an economist at the United States Institute of Peace. As I said earlier, you will find the bios in the chat box. on Zoom. It's important, obviously, to talk about China. It's impossible not to, considering China's digital Silk Road, launched in 2015, together with, I think, another relevant initiative, which is the Global Development Initiative, which have led to a lot of Chinese projects also being deployed in Africa in satellite communications, undersea cables, 5G, 4G, as well as cloud services. And in the meantime, since 2015, and that initiative was launched, there's been obviously this growing US-China tech competition. And it's a region where the US is probably less on its strong foot diplomatically and politically compared to other regions where the US has more influence. So it's also interesting to look at how the US influence plays out in that region, in particular through its private sector, obviously, such as cloud providers. Henry will fill us in on Chinese data centers in Africa. What are their implications for Africa's digital sovereignty, and also compare the approach of the Chinese and Western approaches to data centers in the region. So Henry, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just by way of one-word introduction for those who don't know us, the U.S. Institute of Peace is a non-partisan, independent institute in Washington, D.C., founded by Congress in 1984. So just in case the U.S. name threw you off, we're not part of the U.S. government or anything like that. That said, I should also qualify that the remarks that I'm going to give you today are based on my own personal research as part of my PhD dissertation, and so these really reflect my views and not necessarily the views of the Institute and colleagues who I work with. That out of the way, the main people I'm going to be talking about today are the top cloud service providers in Africa. And what's interesting about this is that it's dominated by US and Chinese firms. Sorry. Bring it around. It's a sector that's dominated by US and Chinese firms. So really you've got 8 firms that you're talking about. You've got IBM, Oracle, Google, Asia, and AWS on the US side, and then you've got Alibaba, Tencent, and Huawei on the Chinese side. So those are the main players I'm going to be talking about. And I'm going to start with the view from Africa, then I'll move to the view from China, then the view from the US, and I'll conclude with some of the implications of what this all means, especially in the context of data sovereignty. So just to begin with the view from Africa, I think this is a fascinating sector because business is booming right now, or demand is booming right now. You have market reports that are speaking breathlessly of the gold rush for data centers and cloud services in Africa. And the reason is that this actually matters as a form of business and as a form of infrastructure for a lot of countries in a way that we wouldn't necessarily recognize as more important than many more advanced economies. Because effectively what you're doing with cloud services is you're outsourcing the responsibility to manage services from within your own company or government institution. And that means you can outsource technical expertise. You don't have to have masses of resources for cooling the servers in hotter climates, and of course the expenses of that. And then of course, you're outsourcing the responsibility for maintaining a stable power supply for these services, which is obviously an issue in a lot of African countries. So for many reasons, this is a very appealing technology that many companies and governments in Africa want, because just like everyone in the world, everybody has masses of data. It's only growing. And so this is a sector that is really taking off right now across the continent. What we've seen so far in terms of the infrastructure is that the first thing that has happened is there's been a boom in the construction of what are known as co-location centers. And these are the data centers that are perhaps built by and owned by local companies or sometimes by international companies, where they will effectively behave like third-party hosts of other servers. Because what happens is with these big 8 cloud service providers that I mentioned at the start, they're not necessarily going to build a massive data center that they own themselves, known as an availability zone in their terminology. As soon as they arrive in a market, they're probably going to start by renting rack space in one of these third-party institutions. And so this was really the focus of my research, who owns what where. What I found very quickly was that, as I said, most companies don't build these availability zones. In fact, of course, as many of you will already know, South Africa is basically the only place where we have availability zones from these major companies. But moving to look at how many of them had already set up infrastructure in these third-party co-location centers, we've only got about 11 out of Africa's 54 countries that are currently hosting what are called content delivery networks, which is honestly somewhat surprising because it suggests that the supply is just not meeting the demand right now. I mean, you're still going to have these data centers in a country like Chad, for example, that may not necessarily have servers from Google or Asia or Huawei or whoever. It'll still be able to sell services to local companies and local government who will still want to send their servers there, but they might not necessarily be able to use the cloud services of these big cloud service providers on the software side, which is important for the data management side of things. Lastly, I did some work on cloud on-ramps. I appreciate this is now getting a little bit too in the weeds, so I can leave that, but just to highlight that only 12 of Africa's 54 countries currently have cloud on-ramps to these major service providers. But again, I appreciate that's a bit more technical, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if people are focused on that. But so moving now to the view from China, why is this demand not being met by the supply effectively? And I thought what was interesting about China is it has this very concerted effort that Alice referred to in terms of the digital Silk Road, where it is nominally interested in developing telecommunications infrastructure, including data centers across the world. And so I started by looking at what that actually means in practice. And I have to say, I'm going to move past it quickly because I think a lot of it is marketing, basically. It's a program that started in 2015, as Alice said, as a subset of the Belt and Road Initiative that started in 2013. But really, the only financial institution that was created as a direct result of the Belt and Road Initiative was the Silk Road Fund. And China State Council released a white paper a couple of weeks ago saying that since the founding of the Silk Road Fund, they've only completed 75 projects worth a total of $22 billion across the whole world, which, I mean, obviously still matters for those 75 projects, but it's nowhere near the scale of what people often refer to when they talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, where they talk about the lending by China Exim Bank and China Development Bank. And the reason I think that's important is because China Exim Bank and China Development Bank have been lending since the early 2000s, and they would be lending with or without the existence of the BRI, as it were. The BRI and the Digital Silk Road Initiative are really just a repackaging of the narrative of how and why China is lending. But these institutions have been lending for digital projects for a very long time. And so when you break it down into who they're lending to, what you find is that Alibaba and Tencent were actually very successful first movers in this space, particularly within the Chinese market and then with Southeast Asia. I'm talking around sort of the 2014, 15, 16, 17 period. And then it's really at the end of the second decade of this century that Huawei starts engaging in cloud services and data centers. And by looking at how Chinese policy banks lend in Africa, what you see is that China Exim Bank has been providing a lot of funding for Huawei to establish cloud services, sometimes in the form of data centers being sold to governments, but basically nothing to Alibaba and Tencent. And I was able to do some field work in South Africa around this time last year, actually. And I was speaking to people working in this space, and they were saying that really they see Alibaba and Tencent as competitors with the American cloud service providers, but that Huawei is somewhat unique in that it's not really competing for the commercial space. You know, I don't know, Air Ethiopia or, you know, big commercial clients or Uber, you know, even Western companies that are operating in Africa. Huawei is not really competing for those clients in the same way that Alibaba, Tencent, Google, Microsoft, and the others are. Huawei has mostly been focused on selling to government clients, such as, say, the Senegalese government or the Congolese government. So I think this is important in understanding, how policy overlaps with markets and how that translates into demand. But then just moving on to the US view on all of this. The US is different because obviously it doesn't have this overarching policy narrative like the Digital Silk Road. What it has at present is a refocus on Africa that is trying to reprioritize economic engagements over security engagements as a distinction from the way that it is engaged with Africa over the past 2 decades at least. And so, I mean, we've seen this a lot over the past year. You've had these state visits from US officials to the continent. You've had a White House policy paper about, how to re-engage with Africa. You've had the US-Africa Summit that's trying to focus a lot more on economic engagements. But really, I think it's very different to China's approach because, if anything, there's almost a hope that US leaders in their field will be able to capitalize on their success in markets like Europe and North America, and by then moving into Africa. But they're just not really doing this. As I say, they're mostly focused on South Africa. And even if you look at these content delivery nodes that I was speaking about, where a big cloud service provider will rent rack space in a foreign country, Huawei currently has representation in 10 countries. Microsoft is the biggest company after Huawei, and it has representation in 6 countries. So it's shy. It's not, it's not taking the risks that the US government would perhaps want. So what we're seeing in response to that is now the US, I think, is starting to use some of the same techniques, tools as China, which is to incentivize business. And so we've seen this with the Development Finance Corporation offering a $300 million loan to Africa Data Centers, which is a third-party company in Africa that builds and manages co-location centers. So what are the implications of this? Well, I think there's a real tension here between the US and China as Africa's largest provider of cloud services and Africa's desire for some shape or form of digital sovereignty. Just like everyone else, they want to be able to protect the data of their citizens, protect the data that their government holds, sensitive data. But the issue with the US and China providing most of these services and most of this infrastructure so far is that they both have laws that prioritize their security services access to overseas data. You've got the US Cloud Act in the US, and then of course you've got China's data security law in China. Interestingly, both the US and China have tried to create these diplomatic outreach programs to countries in Africa and elsewhere. China's Ministry of Commerce published a Harnessing the China-Africa ICT Opportunities in 2017. And then the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs introduced the Global Data Security Initiative in 2020. And then similarly, the US has the Cloud Act services, which does allow for certain bilateral agreements to reassure foreign partners. But really, I mean, ultimately, these two are seen as somewhat meaningless from the African perspective, because both China and the US still prioritize the access of their national security interests over this overseas data. So this is really where the EU has this great opportunity to prioritize the GDPR. And obviously, we've already heard about that. And I think that matters because we've already seen countries like Benin, Mauritius, and Nigeria repeal earlier national data security laws that they had when GDPR was introduced in 2016, so that they could copy effectively the legislation of GDPR to apply to their own services. So I think fundamentally the challenge that many African countries have is going to be their ability to enforce this legislation, even if they pass it. They want these services, but they also want protection. And so at the moment, they're fighting this battle where they are trying to create market opportunities that will be welcoming to the market leaders from China and the US. But they also don't trust the service providers as much as they may like to. And so I think there's a real opportunity here for the Pan-African data protection that David was talking about just before. And not only to create something that is more holistic across African countries, and therefore, an agreed set of principles that hopefully would allow for greater enforceability, but also would reduce barriers to entry for foreign firms who are looking to move into that country. If you have a market as small as Chad again, for example, sorry to pick on Chad, but if you have a smaller market and you've got a big company like AWS or Alibaba, they're not necessarily going to see the market value in making sure that they have legal compliance over smaller markets. Whereas if you have Pan-African data laws, then you are going to get, it's going to be much easier for big companies to invest, basically. So I think I'm going to leave my remarks there for now, but happy to talk about more of this in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Henry. That was super interesting. And thank you for bringing in the matters of government clients in Africa, as well as their interests that they can pursue through those, that they're trying to pursue through those infrastructure projects and services. That leads me to turn to Folashade Soule Kandu, who's co-principal investigator for the Negotiating Africa's Digital Partnerships project at the University of Oxford. And since we've just heard about the EU's Global Gateway, US and Chinese data center projects within or without big government initiatives for those projects. But that obviously begs the question of what's in it for African governments? How do they negotiate those partnerships on their own end? And perhaps also what are some of the conditions that come with those partnerships? We've heard about the data protection questions, but there's also sometimes, especially when we talk about China's projects in Africa, we hear that they're opaque, that sometimes even they're low quality, or that they can be risky in terms of surveillance data and other cybersecurity concerns and data protection concerns. So I'm turning to you to please present your research on national government strategies from African countries and their partnerships, especially with China. The floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alice. I would like to thank also IFRI and all the organizers of this conference for putting this together and inviting me to participate. So this project takes place in a context of rising geopolitical tensions, as we've mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, between some of the world's biggest digital powers. And looking at it from an African perspective and from the vantage point of African actors, this has added quite some complexity. So the project asks a couple of questions, and the ones that I will be presenting here are: how are African governments choosing their digital partners? What is the specific role of China here? And also, how are they navigating this geopolitical rivalry? The countries that are covered are, well, beyond the big ones that are usually covered, the usual suspects, as I would say, by the literature, like Kenya, South Africa, that we've heard of a bit. I also wanted to focus on more middle powers and small Francophone African powers. How are they managing these relationships? I'm thinking of Benin, Togo, Senegal, also a bit Guinea, Algeria, and also islands like Mauritius. So just maybe some of the summary of the findings so that you can see where I'm heading to is that first, it has not gone unnoticed. There is an effect of geopolitical competition on the continent, but these actors, mostly the government actors that are focused on, and I'll talk a bit also about private actors, but the main focus is on governments. They have found ways to navigate these rivalries by setting up a category of some strategies, but also by diversifying partners and establishing joint ventures for some. This mix of approaches has well, allowed them for some to achieve their goals despite all these tensions. So how are they choosing their digital partners? First of all, and this has been said a bit in the beginning, with all the issues related to the digital divide, the lack of internet access, penetration. Many of the countries, many of African governments are, say they needed partnership. Digital partnerships are key for them, were key for them and still are, to establish not only their national digital strategies, but also implementing different digital infrastructure. And so the choice of a partner over another is guided by the alignment of the potential partner, whether it's US, China, or the EU to deliver with the priorities in these policy documents. But this also all depends on the initial level of digital development in the country. We cannot compare a country like, I don't know, Sierra Leone, for instance, with Mauritius. So in the case of Mauritius, for instance, the progress on building out their cybersecurity framework, but also overall, Mauritius promotes itself as a digital economy, and this was mostly achieved via partnerships, and a key one being the EU, with the Cyber for Dev initiative. Other small countries like Benin have also had an evolution in terms of their partnership. It's the same with Togo, where in the beginning they would turn to countries like China for big turnkey projects, right? Providing both the infrastructure, the software, knowledge transfer, expertise, and so on. That was in the early 2000s. Nowadays, it's more about digital partnerships, partnership diversification. And to take the example of Benin, they have what they call this best-in-class partners strategy, where you have one category of partners that complement the country's strategic objectives, like Rwanda, for instance, Estonia on e-government expertise, and these are long-term partners. And then you have a second category of actors that are more business-oriented. Henry talked about this business component that is very strategic in the way these partnerships are established. And in that case, digital infrastructure is mainly provided by China for different reasons, provision of funding, favorable debt repayments. China was very much quoted as a preferred partner for digital infrastructure projects. Although there were some nuanced views that I would come back to. In the case of still talking about China, we mentioned the Digital Silk Road, the BRI. Well, it was clear to many that China is considered as a major partner. It was in the beginning, it still is the case. There are several of these projects that have been rebranded nowadays as, the DSN, BRI, but there is this compatibility with, China's, some of their companies like Huawei, that is very often quoted as being more locally implemented in the continent. There are many, I'll show a graph here, where Huawei is a bit present everywhere, both local offices, national implementation. And something that I noticed also is that many of the top-level management is more and more Africanized, meaning they are looking for local managers on site, which is not the case in other Chinese companies when it comes to road infrastructure and other type of infrastructure. However, this is something that I mentioned. There seems to be like in many of these countries some kind of a division of digital labor, if I can put it that way, where there's a specific attribution of roles, like China and equipment. China is on digital infrastructure, but when it comes to licensing software, equipment, it's not exclusively Chinese. It can be Microsoft for e-government services. Even in countries like Senegal, that for we talked about Senegal and the Diamniadio data center that is exclusively built, with a Chinese grant and with Huawei. Still, many of the digital services and other type of partnerships are also implemented with partners like France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, the EU, and so on. So there is partnership diversification is considered as something key for them. There were nuanced views on China, of course, both, especially in these big, some of the digital projects were part of RFI, Resource for Infrastructure projects. And in the case of Guinea, at least under Alpha Condé, there were complaints about the fact that technology was not, some of the technology projects and digital projects were not implemented. But that is not necessarily, the issue doesn't come necessarily from the partner. It's also because some of the priorities, political priorities by some of these African governments were more directed to infrastructure, road infrastructure, and so on. So this was quite late. Technology projects were not implemented in the 20 billion framework, at least not yet. And here's something that I also wanted to say about the negotiations in itself. On the contrary of large railway, like transport, bridges, or even mining projects, digital projects are less politicized. They are much less politicized, and this has an effect on the negotiations from the African perspectives, meaning there's less political pressure coming from African governments to implement, like fast or as quick as possible. This gives more space for more detailed negotiations. Also, how the governments are structured has also an impact on that. Many of these projects are negotiated by like technical agencies or commissions. Some of the, like Agence du développement du numérique, many of these digital commissions within these countries. And this allows for some of the, I call it TDR, but in English it will be procurement, to be like more detailed and to give also more space to negotiate questions related to knowledge transfer, technology transfer as well. And this is where some countries like Togo were very interesting to talk to, because they decided, they really showed how they would partner with the way they would frame these internal clauses in the negotiations around knowledge transfer in order to build a local capacity is something key. The more detailed these contracts were, the more detailed these clauses were about how knowledge will be transferred to whom, what will be the content. This provided for better negotiation outcomes. So to come back to the geopolitical rivalries and what the repercussions at the local level, there are concrete repercussions where some African countries or governments are asked, that they will not accept some of the provider services if they use any equipment coming from Chinese companies. One example was also some of the projects coming from US aid, in order to get a grant from US aid in the digital sector. There are some clauses where they should not be using, Huawei materials and so on. And so where, let's say some private actors are also affected by this, by private African actors. One example is C-Squared, that's a company based in Nairobi that implements, that sets up digital infrastructure projects, like undersea cables, fiber optic, and so on. And their investors are also coming from like Western countries, and they are asked not to use Chinese material. So they have to decouple some of the previous digital infrastructure infrastructure that was present in order to implement new ones that are not using like Chinese materials. However, what I've noticed from a government perspective is that the stance is much more pragmatic. It could be one of the, that was in Benin, one of the interviewees said clearly that they have this business attitude, that the enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my enemy, at least not in the when it comes to concluding contracts. There's also this willingness to avoid a zero-sum game, not picking one partner over the other, especially for middle-income countries. And also the fact that this competition could be positive. And that was the case in Senegal, where many of the interviewees noticed that the offers that were coming, since there is this willingness to compete with China or contain China for others, the offers that were coming to the table were much more interesting, right? Much more, they were much more interesting for the African partners. So there was some positive impact for this. In the case of Algeria and Egypt, this was also mentioned, right? The fact that it's impossible for many of, let's say close to impossible for many African governments to just choose the US over China for all kinds of reasons, especially of the price competitiveness, and also because of most access to loans is easier. And also one thing that should be kept in mind is also that many of these governments, it's a political factor. They have to deliver. Whether we are talking about democracies or autocracies, there are electoral objectives also, but there are also just regime survival. So whether it's the digital sector, road infrastructure, they need to deliver. So they are looking for partners that are quick, let's say, coming up with like interesting packages that they, as governments, could then use and justify as this is what we've done over the past 5 years, this is what we will be doing, and so on. So I mentioned this. Another example, and I'll end on that, is the how with China, it's mostly bilateral, and I think that's a Chinese approach also to negotiate. But something that has also come up is the multilateral level and how they negotiate through many of the African multilateral institutions like the African Union, and multilateralism has played a key role in Africa's digital development. So I mentioned a few of the conventions there that have been used as well as platforms to negotiate collectively. Both large but also sub-regional alliances. However, there is still this issue where larger nations like Kenya, South Africa, to some extent Egypt, tend to go for it alone when they negotiate with China, for instance. There is not this collective approach, but that's also because of the variable level of development and of priorities. But this does have an impact, beyond, they do not necessarily tackle collectively on issues that have an impact beyond their borders. And this is also because of a competition factor. They are all in competition to attract investments. And a final thing that I would also say is that sometimes negotiations within some of these governments, that something that came up a lot is the fact that digital partnerships are very much considered as a technical issue or a technical matter. And so there is not necessarily a coordination between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Comms to negotiate these partnerships, which also has an impact on the outcomes because the geopolitical dimension for it is totally a foreign policy issue, and where the ministries of foreign affairs could provide input during the negotiation process, especially at the bilateral level. I think I'll end on that. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer further questions or expand on some of the elements that I mentioned during this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Folashade. Very interesting to hear about this idea of those projects being quite technical and not so political. When we see how much tech has become politicized, it almost blew my mind suddenly. I was like, how can it not be? How is it technical only? But that's a very good reminder of what are the pragmatic priorities that maybe those of actors, and they will choose whatever fits their needs more than what fits the big geopolitical international landscape and influence games. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to turn to Fabrice André, who's Senior Vice President for Orange operations in Central and Southern Africa and Indian Ocean. We would like to hear about Orange's strategy vis-à-vis digital infrastructure in various regions of Africa where you've worked along the years, and how a private actor like Orange also navigates these various initiatives and funding projects, and how much of a public-private interconnection is there, looking from the standpoint of a French telecom provider, and also perhaps a word about how European private actors position themselves compared to African and American providers, Chinese and American providers that we've heard about so far. So, Fabrice André, the floor is yours. Merci.
Yes, thank you very much, Alice. And this is a testimony of Orange, telecommunication company present in 17 countries in Africa. When developing digital in Africa, we have in fact three main challenges. The first one is on the last mile, that is giving access to data to everybody, everywhere in the continent. There is still a lot to be done. If Western Africa, Northern Africa are quite well covered, this is not the case in the central part of Africa, in Madagascar, in DRC, for example. We estimate that only 35% of the population is covered by the mobile networks, which is quite low in such a big country. So there is still a lot to be done. So first, we have to make coverage with a mobile network. We have to introduce the digital technology. We discover when we make this coverage and when it's quite consistent that there is a strong need for digital use. I take the example of Dakar, where we invested, and the more we invest, the more the people use the network, and the more they want the network. At the end, there is no other solution to build a fixed network in Africa. If you asked me 10 years ago whether there would be a fixed network in Africa, everybody at the telecom operators said there would never be, as the mobile technology was the solution. But in fact, mobile is so much used that fixed network is a necessity in big cities after a certain number of time. So this is a reason why fiber technology is being introduced as fixed networks in main African cities. At last, there will still be very remote rural areas where we see that satellite technology and satellite constellations will be a solution. We see Starlink that is starting to operate in several African countries, but there will be also European projects in these areas. So there will be investment in mobile technologies, in fixed technologies, and in satellite technologies. The suppliers here, it's mostly Chinese and European for mobile technology, but Chinese is more and more present, as the prices are much lower than the European technologies, and the quality is excellent. We do not have any more Chinese low cost, low quality. No, Chinese very, very high quality, very competitive quality, and very low prices. So for mobile technologies and for fiber, it's much more Chinese and European. For satellite, for the time being, more US technology. The second challenge is on the global connectivity. When we have the access to the population, we have to make some backbone networks, some submarine cables to access. The backbone networks are often made by Chinese technology again, or European technologies. As for the submarine cables, it's interesting to see that they are provided more and more by Google, Facebook, American over-the-top that are investing a lot to access to the more than 1 billion African people and 2 billion in 2050. There is also, in the matter of connectivity, the question of data center that was also said before. Data center, some 5 years ago, all data centers that were used by African people were in Europe or in the US, but more and more we see the emergence of data center in Africa, which are more and more, for the time being, cache data center, which means they make copies of contents that are made that are in other parts of the world. But I'm sure for the future there will be more and more some pure African contents that will be developed in Africa. But so data centers are not too much developed for the time being. That's just a few very high-level data centers in a few countries, in South Africa, in Ivory Coast, in Dakar, in, of course, Northern Africa. And this is a challenge for the future to have more and more data centers. And in this, here, it's much more US technology, even if Huawei is trying to invest a lot, to be present a lot. And so we'll see in the future what will be the results. But I'm sure Chinese people will make their best to have the best possible technology at the lowest price and to be present in Africa. One last point, one last challenge, maybe quickly, is accessibility. When you have the network, the connectivity, you also need the people to use mobile devices. There is still a lot to be done in mobile devices, especially for poor people. Poor people, they cannot afford a device that is more than $7 for a basic device, or more than $20 for a smartphone. And for the time being, there is not really some devices at that price that work properly. So there will, to have all the African people using mobile technology, we will need to have good quality devices at very, very low price. And this is, for the time being, a battle between China and US, as you have the device is often Chinese and the OS is Android, in fact. So there will be probably a challenge in this field in the future. To maybe now talking about some of our concerns. In fact, funding is not really a big concern for us, as we do not invest in roads, in nuclear power, or in. So our investments, they get returns after 7 years, and we can have the normal financing by the margin, by the operational margin after a certain time. We can raise debt or have capital for the initial creation of the operators, and so as for us, we very seldom use money coming from the development fund, international fund institutions. That's our suppliers do, but we don't. In fact, because probably we don't need. In fact, when we try to use that type of money, but we discovered that we have it at financial conditions that are not better than what we get from the banks. So we get it from the banks, and it's better for us. But probably in the far future, we may have a real concern when we will have to put fiber in every country, everywhere in Africa. This will be much more costly than the mobile network, and probably there will be some concern for funding in 5 to 10 years when we will have to put fiber in all African cities and not only in the big capital. By the way, our main concerns are concerns on the global environment. First on regulation. We face environments where the regulation is not necessarily stable, not predictable, not homogeneous, and not sane. If I can insist on some of these words, not stable. For example, we have licenses that are 15 to 20 years licenses, where we sign conditions to work for 15 years. And we see after 10 years, the government that may change the conditions and not respect the signature of the government 10 years before. That's good for us as we make an investment according to what we think we can afford with our license. The regulation can also be not sane. For example, we have a universal service fund in order to have the financing of mobile sites in places where there is no return on investment. But in fact, this is something between 1% to 3% of our revenues that is invested every year in a fund. The fund is located in the government, but it's not used. And in some cases, it's used when there is a need for a war, something like that. Well, that's not good to have rules that are not really used the proper way. One other concern can be also about monopolies. Monopolies is not a good point in our business. In fact, we have two types of monopolies we face. The first one is on backbone networks, and it's due to, in some cases, to development funding institutions or to China. I saw the example of Guinea, which is interesting. This partnership between Guinea and China led to the funding by China of a backbone network in Guinea. So Afreximbank gave the money to, lend the money to Guinea to build a backbone network. Afterwards, the Guinean government discovered that they had to give the money back to China after some number of years. So they put a monopoly on the backbone network. They increased the price. So we have a monopoly for the backbone network with high prices that have an impact on the final price for the consumer, and with low quality as it's operated by the government, which is not will guarantee to have good operations. And we see other places. In other places, it can be World Bank that financed the backbone network for here or there, and where the state had to institute a monopoly to be sure to get the money back. And at the end, this is not necessarily made in the best way. In Guinea, once again, it's a real concern for us. The 4G doesn't work properly in the provinces due to the fact that the fiber is not working properly between the provinces and the capital. That's bad. One last point, one last concern we have is on taxation. Just to say to you, it happens that more than 50% of what the consumer pays goes to taxes. The mean figure is something like 30%, but it could be huge. And prices, African people, they need low prices because they don't have much money, and it's easy to use telecommunication to raise taxes because, Africa is informal, so economy is informal. It's very difficult to get taxes from most of the population and of the companies. So it's easier to take the money from the people who are using the telephony. But at the end, it can be counterproductive. There were studies that were made on the what we call the average effective tax rate, that measures the proportion of the rent from a telecom license that is captured by taxes or the state, and it can be over 100%. In Niger, it was 118%. So Orange went out of Niger because we would never get money from this country. In DRC, it's 98%. So the government, it's so easy to take taxes from the telecom operator that at the end it can be bad for the company. what we say, what we try to say to the government is lower the taxes, so the use will be higher. You will get VAT, and please use also the mobile money, because if you use the mobile money, you can increase your effectiveness in raising taxes. In Guinea, once again, the tax for automobile was is now has to be paid by electronic money. And the first year they introduced that, the amount of taxes that were raised was multiplied by 3. So it's more effective. So that's it for myself.
Thank you so much, Fabrice. I see it's already 15 to 4. No, 15 to 4. So we have 15 minutes left for this panel. So sorry, I would like to open the floor for questions and remarks and comments, also possibly questions or remarks from panelists or reacting to what was said by others. Please raise your hand in the room if you have questions. Mathilde, give me a sign. There is a question online. Should I take the question online if there is no question for the moment? Otherwise, I will also have follow-up questions.
Thank you. So the question from online is the following. As Dr. Soulé pointed out, bigger African countries tend to develop on their own the digitalization in their country. Isn't there a risk that the investments could be focused on the most hotly contested country, digitally speaking? To that extent, isn't there a risk to increase disparity in the digitalization of Africa because of the lack of efficiency within small African countries? Wouldn't it be the most challenging issue above the competition with the US and Chinese influence on the digital sector? A lot of questions into one question, but...
Is there, in the meantime, a question from the audience? Otherwise, I will have a question, which was... okay, I've lost my question. Do you want to tackle this one? No. Okay, Sina. Sorry, I've lost my question. I actually had a question for you. I didn't.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask one question to Fola Shadi, because I was also a bit intrigued by the fact that you said that digital infrastructure is less politicized than other sectors. And I just wanted to know if you have any data on how this geopolitical competition is addressed maybe in the public opinion, if you have any examples of local civil society organizations reacting to this competition and to the diversification of partnerships. Thank you so much in advance.
I'll actually add a question to Fola Shadi as well, since you have already quite a few. But I was curious, since in your presentation you didn't really mention much about Europe and Global Gateway. I was just curious to see if that had come up in your interviews, and in what actors that you've interviewed thought about that initiative. And actually, to David, you briefly mentioned this intent of the EU and the US to try and work together on digital infrastructure projects in Africa and elsewhere. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on how different is it from the way things have been done before, in terms of to what extent there was cooperation in the past on projects between EU and the US, or is it really a new thing? And what's the ambition? I mean, what's the and how realistic is it, considering that there is also a level of obviously economic competition between economic actors of the US and Europe? Although I thought it was interesting what Fabrice said about also this kind of like distribution of this functional distribution between what EU private actors provide and what US private actors provide and what Chinese private actors provide, which was also reflected, I think, in Fola Shadi's point. But yeah, that would be my question. Still no question from within the room? Okay, so maybe, are you ready to tackle some of your points? and then David, and then in the meantime, please raise your hands if you have a question.
Yes, since we don't have much time, I will encompass all the answers to the question. With regards to Europe, the Global Gateway, I think what came up in some of the interviews, and actually they are all online, the interviews with all these senior policymakers. I can give you the link later. It's like quite extensive interviews. But what came up, as I mentioned, was really this division of labor, the fact that European companies, the European actors were, at least from the government's point of view, were very much privileged partners when it comes to like software, equipment, licensing, and so on. Their material was considered of better quality. That's something that came up. However, something that also came up, and that comes to your question, is more of the normative discussions. How questions related to digital rights, for instance, that come up with all these policies of data localization or like this control over data, and you have some civil society actors like the Africa Digital Rights Hub that play a key role. They are based in Ghana, but they cover many African countries, and they do provide support to the governments in establishing digital rights strategies, but also during the negotiations to have this to play this role of looking after these issues that are not necessarily considered a priority, that come often after infrastructure, digital infrastructure projects, and so on. So yes, I think when it comes to the politicization, what I was trying to say is that when it comes to electoral gains for African parties, political parties or governments, what is considered more of let's say something to show or something to gain votes in certain districts is not necessarily digital projects. A road that has been built in a region or a province is more can provide more electoral gains than the digital project. So it's not that it is not important, because then it comes back after us. Like this is a package, especially in the urban areas, but it's not like the most politicized project. And that is positive to some extent for the negotiations, because there's less interference. So that's what I was trying to say. Thank you.
Thank you. There was my question for David. I think there is one more question online, and I will also have one more question for Henry and Fabrice. Still no hand up here. One hand. Yeah. David, I'll give you the floor and then take a last round of questions.
Thanks. I mean, the question online I think was interesting. And my first thought was Rwanda versus the DRC. Rwanda is a small country, but Rwanda is doing great because it's got its legal framework in place. They know what they want. The telecom, the digital program in Rwanda is very significant. Smart Africa, supported by Rwanda, and it's a small country. The DRC is a big country, and it lacks a lot of these things. So I think the small country, big country, is not the defining factor for a lot of these investments. I think the regulatory framework and so on is it's obviously really important. And where we're looking at investment, I mean, as André said, finance is not always key, but what will chase away investment is if the regulatory environment, whether it's about telecoms or about tax. And those are the same issues in Europe as they are in Africa and anywhere else, I think. And on Global Gateway, I mean, Global Gateway as a brand, if you like, we don't expect everybody in Africa to talk about Global Gateway when they're talking about the EU. But if they're talking about the EU, then that's fine. And I think one of the points, I mean, as Folashade said, is that, the regulatory issues have been our biggest contribution up to now. I mean, when we look at the previous budgetary framework, the last 7-year budget of the EU, we spent about 500 million euros on digital around the world. In the current budget from 20 to 27, 5 or 6 billion probably available for investment in digital. And that's obviously not just that's designed to mobilize a lot more money through the EIB, through de-risking for private sector and so on. So we're talking a multiplication of at least 10 in terms of the amount of money we have available. So of course, the European impact in Africa on digital up to now is very much more about regulation. Now what we're trying to do is to see how we can link regulation with investment in digital infrastructure, because obviously that's important, huh? And that's a combination of cables. We're looking at cables in Central Africa. We're looking at mobile networks in East Africa, and on the West Coast as well. And I think rolling out connectivity is key, because I think, as André said, there's still a big challenges in basic connectivity, and there's a lack of broadband. The regulatory part is really important, and I think looking ahead, one of the big things we're going to be doing, looking at AI, because I think when you look at what is happening on AI in Nigeria or in Kenya or in Rwanda, for example, this is not simply something that's happening in Silicon Valley or in Shenzhen or in London. And we want to see how we can work together with our partners. We've got the AI Act, we hope to be adopted in the next couple of months in Europe, and that's going to be the first fully comprehensive attempt to regulate AI on a risk-based approach, combined with a huge amount of investment in high-performance computing and so on in Europe as well. And we want to see how we can work with our African partners, both on connecting up to our high-performance computing network. So when you look at the Medusa cable, for example, linking north and south of the Mediterranean, we expect a lot of that usage is going to be about AI, for example, and research on AI. You won't be able to do research in any area without the use of AI in the future. So I think looking ahead, we're looking at seeing how we can link up our investments together with cooperation on research, on innovation, and on the type of regulatory challenges that'll be coming along for Africa, the same as for everybody else on artificial intelligence. So.
Thank you. Very interesting. We have a question here. Do we still have a question online as well? Okay. So please introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you. I'm a journalist from Xinhua News Agency. I have a specific question for Mr. Fabrice André. Because I was a Orange user back in Cameroon when I was a journalist there. So I would like to ask you a question about the Orange Money, which is the digital payment technology of your company. Could you please introduce more about the strategy of your company in developing this technology, and what are your main competitors in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. And we add up the. Can you add it now so we can then finish please?
Sure. So I have 3 questions online. The first one concerns Eritrea. Why does Eritrea, which is in a geographical area where large telecommunications cable paths, do not take advantage of this to be served digitally? The second one is how to assess the effectiveness of the youth capacity building in the field of AI, and is it adequate to prepare them to participate in AI development? And the last one, I think, is maybe more directed to Mr. Ringrose. How does the EU assess the return and the impact on its digital investments in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps the AI capacity building we may touch upon that maybe in the second panel. Yes, so sorry, I lost track. I think
maybe in a few words, mobile money technology and services are more and more used in Africa, as it's a very commonly used in the families to have somebody getting money in the cities and sending the money to the family in the villages. Nowadays, so the mobile money service, every operator has a mobile money service. There will be in the future, I'm sure, some interconnection also between the mobile money services it's operating. It's the case, for example, in Madagascar and Tanzania, in some countries. So sending money from a telephone to another one as just a wallet with a small amount of money is a convenient service. Just to give you an idea on the service for Orange in Africa, it's about 10% of our revenues that come from this service. So it's very important. In a country like Mali, for example, there is something like 10 times the GDP of the country that goes inside the system every year. So this is very significant. And this is a way of making, I call it financial inclusion, is giving access to some digital technology for finance to many people.
Thank you. Maybe very quickly, David, also I note that you did not tackle my question about EU-US cooperation. Did you have a final word or? Okay. So just, you have the final word, David, in 1 or 2 minutes, and then we'll take a break. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so there's two framework. One is the Trading Technology Council, where we're discussing connectivity with the United States. And rather than discuss in an abstract fashion, we're trying to discuss concretely. So looking at countries around the world where we can work together. I mean, initially we were thinking joint projects. Now, joint project, of course, is extremely complicated, different timetables, processes, and so on. But then we're trying to see if there are places where we can work together, where we have complementary projects, and we can show the benefits of working with the EU and the US. And as I said, so at the last Trade and Technology Council, we announced sort of partnerships with Jamaica, with Kenya, the Philippines, and so on. And then, as part of the G7, you have the PGII, where there's a number of projects as well. And we're working together with Japan under our connectivity partnership, doing cyber diplomacy, cyber training in Southeast Asia, for example. There's also, with the US, the European Investment Bank signed a memorandum of understanding with the Development Finance Corporation, the DFC, because the DFC has been quite active in financing digital infrastructure in a few places around the world. And the EIB and the DFC are looking if they can work together on these issues. And on the point about the question from the audience about the impact, I think Folashade's point was really interesting, because I think it showed that everybody's looking for agency and relevance and pragmatic transactional approach to all these type of things. And this is what we've heard. And when I mentioned the big jump in investment funding, this reflects the fact that we've been, nobody wants the European Union to knock on your door and tell you what you shouldn't be doing, because they'll say, well, fine, give us an alternative, give us a better alternative. And so that's why we're trying to ensure that we can identify places where we can provide a better alternative. And I think in many cases, price is not the most important thing, because we're quite aware that in many cases, the prices of competing offers from other actors is not necessarily market-based. And so we're trying to see how we can ensure that you're looking at issues like energy usage, cyber issues and stuff like that when making choices. So I think the impact, well, we'll see. I think we're not asking people who sign contracts with European companies to sign up for a lot of things, but we are nevertheless, if you look at Latin America, for example, we just set up this digital alliance with Latin America, where we've emphasized that this is kind of a values-based alliance. We're committed to principles of trusted connectivity and so on and so on. So we're trying increasingly to see how we can work with our partners on these issues and bringing, as you said, this up to a foreign policy issue. So it's not simply making a deal with a telecom company, but it's also saying, look, this matters from a foreign policy point of view as well. And we'd like to discuss this from a foreign policy angle, which is just the same in the European Union as well, where we see that many foreign ministries in the EU are not up to speed on what quantum is, why it matters, what artificial intelligence is, why it matters. So we're trying also to do that with our own member states.
Great, thank you so much. We have to close this panel because it's already 5 past, and we have a break, a coffee break. Coffee's just outside. Please come back within 15 minutes. We'll start just a few minutes late before before 4:20. And also, I forgot to mention that there is a cocktail after the conference starting at 5:45, just next door. Thank you, and thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the audience, and see you in a few minutes.
Thanks very much.